Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of history's great ironies, a real head-scratcher. We're talking about how a system built by the British to control India actually ended up giving Indians the tools to fight back. And we're going to see this play out in colonial Bihar. So let's get right into it. This is the big question, right? How does that even happen? The British wanted to create a class of loyal English-speaking administrators to make their lives easier. But in the process, they accidentally unleashed a set of ideas that would ultimately challenge their entire empire. It's a classic case of unintended consequences, and it's absolutely fascinating. Okay, so our story gets going in the early 1800s. The British East India Company is sitting on this massive, complex territory, and they have a serious problem. How do you actually govern this place effectively? They decided the answer was education. And the first big move was the Charter Act of 1813. Now, this act set aside 1 lakh rupees every year for Indian education. For the time, that was a pretty significant amount of money. Sounds great, right? Well, it immediately kicked off a huge fight over a simple question. How on earth do we spend it? This debate basically split the British officials into 2 camps. On one side, you had the Orientalists. They believed the money should go towards reviving traditional Indian learning, funding institutions that taught in Sanskrit and Persian. But on the other side, you had the Anglicists. They argued, no, the future is Western science and literature, and it has to be taught in English. And this argument just raged on for more than 20 years. That is, until 1835, when one man wrote a memo that was so powerful, so decisive, it basically ended the debate and shaped Indian education for the next 100 years. And this is the most famous, or maybe infamous, line from that document. It was written by Thomas Babington Macaulay in his Minute on Education. I mean, just think about that for a second. With one sentence, he dismissed thousands of years of Indian literature and philosophy. It was a total victory for the Anglicists. From that point on, British policy was all about promoting European knowledge through the English language. Now, here's a crucial point. The plan was never to educate everybody, not even close. The strategy was something called the downward filtration theory. The idea was to educate a very small, elite group of Indians. They would become, in Macaulay's own words, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. The hope was that this new class would then let all that modern knowledge slowly filter down to everyone else. All right, so with the debate settled and the theory in place, the British started building the actual system. They needed to create the schools and colleges that would produce this new class of English-speaking collaborators, and Bihar became a really important testing ground for this whole experiment. And you can see the plan rolling out right here. Institutions started popping up, mostly in cities like Patna. It began with Patna College, way back in 1839. Then things really picked up steam after a report called Wood's Dispatch in 1854, which has been called the Magna Carta of Indian Education. By 1917, Bihar had its very own university. A whole new educational world was taking shape. And you know what? In a way, the system was a huge success. It did exactly what it was designed to do. It produced a new English-speaking middle class. The lawyers, the doctors, the teachers, and most importantly for the British, the clerks and administrators who could help run the colony. But all this progress came with a pretty steep price. While these new English schools were getting all the government funding and attention, the traditional learning centers, the pathshalas and madrasas, were starved of support. They just began to fade away, and that caused a massive cultural shift. So, from the outside, it looks like the British plan is working perfectly. They're getting their loyal administrators, but deep within the curriculum itself, something else was growing, something they never, ever intended. Let's just quickly remember the goal here. It was simple. Create a compliant workforce that spoke English and would help keep the British Empire running smoothly. And the tool to achieve that goal was a Western-style education. So, sure, students were reading Shakespeare, but they were also studying European history, the thinkers of the Enlightenment, and modern political philosophy. And here's where the story takes a wild turn. What kind of ideas do you find when you start reading about the history of Europe and America? What are the concepts that underpin Western democracy? Well, suddenly, this new Bihari elite is being flooded with these radical, powerful ideas. We're talking about liberty, equality, democracy, and nationalism.
These were the exact same ideas that had sparked the American and French revolutions.
So, what happens next is almost inevitable, right? They start looking around at their own lives, at their own country, and they begin to apply these new concepts. They're learning about justice and freedom in the classroom, but the second they step outside, they're living under colonial rule. That contradiction became impossible to ignore. This intellectual fire first sparked a strong sense of regional identity. The educated Biharis felt they were getting a raw deal, not just from the British, but also from the Bengalis, who held most of the good government jobs in the larger Bengal presidency. So they used their new skills to organize, launch newspapers, and argue for their own province. And they succeeded. Bihar became a separate province in 1912.
And this is the ultimate irony. From that regional movement, national leaders began to emerge. People like Dr. Rajendra Prasad, who would go on to become the very first president of an independent India. He was a product of this exact educational system. The schools designed to produce loyal clerks ended up producing revolutionary leaders.
So when we look back, what is the final legacy of Western education in colonial Bihar? Well, it's not a simple story. It's really a tale of two completely different and often contradictory outcomes.
It really was a double-edged sword. On one hand, you have empowerment. The system brought in modern science and liberal ideas. It built major universities, and it created the intellectual class that would lead India to freedom. But on the other hand, you have alienation. It pushed aside traditional knowledge. It created a huge cultural gap between the English-speaking elite and everyone else, and it often made existing inequalities even worse. And that brings us right back to our central paradox. The system was a tool of control that became a weapon for freedom. It was a force that built up a nation while also creating deep divisions that we still see today. So, was it a foundation for progress or a gilded cage? Well, the truth is, it was somehow, paradoxically, both.